hosting the kinds of conversations that churches should be hosting, in our view. So, welcome. Thank you for braving the elements. If you need to find the facilities, as long as you don't all need to go at once, there are washrooms just through these doors to your right. There's a disabled washroom and a men's and a women's. If you are really stuck, you can go downstairs to the lower level or upstairs to the third level, and there's an elevator just along this hallway here. So please make yourselves at home. Following tonight's lecture, there is a reception which will be held in our crump room, which is accessible directly through these doors to your right, and I hope that you'll have time to warm yourselves up before you head out again. Now, I asked a couple of people, we're having a vote, is it Lebel or Lebel? Lebel, you see, you can tell I came from the east, but I always get caught here in Calgary by pronouncing words as if they might have a sort of French tinge to them, and then I learn that I'm quite wrong. So I found myself asking. But it is our privilege to welcome Professor Doug Shantz, who is going to speak to us about the church and the academy. Now, I know from my little bit of theological education that it was about 1800 years ago that the Carthaginian Christian apologist Tertullian asked, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? And my sense is that we have been asking that question and answering it ever since. And so you've got your chance to set us straight tonight, Doug. So we're glad to have a chance once again to be thinking about these questions. Now, I would like at this time to invite Professor Kevin Quillen from the University of Calgary to bring greetings. He is, he's not a new dean at the university, but he is a new dean of arts in their reconfigured structure. And I'm surprised you, having sort of worked in the academy briefly myself, I'm surprised that you had any time to come out this evening. But I'm glad you did, and would you please come and introduce our speaker?
Great, thank you, Anthony, and thank you for clarifying the name of the lecture, because I would have been guessing myself on the correct pronunciation. It's a pleasure to be here tonight on behalf of the university for the lecture that Doug is going to present to us very soon. We're really privileged at the University of Calgary to be home to the chair in Christian thought and the program of teaching and research that goes along with it. The study of religious ideas and traditions, I think, is more important than ever in modern university. And we know it has disappeared from many universities across Canada. We only need to look at the newspapers every day to see the centrality of religious ideas and religious thought in terms of many, many issues that are occurring in society. I picked up the paper this morning, and of course, like many of you, fascinated with the events that are transpiring in Egypt these days. Not directly religious, of course, more political in nature, but it's also clear that there's a religious dimension to them, and one that may grow more important in the days ahead. And probably some of you saw the article on the controversy about some Muslim parents in Calgary wondering whether they should withdraw or could withdraw their children from music classes, the phys ed classes in the city. And so virtually every day we see, either in our city or in our country or many places around the world, the significance of issues, controversies that in some way or another involve religion. And I think it's unfortunate that many universities across the country have backed away from having departments of religious studies, and in some sense even from exploring some of the important religious issues today. We're very, very fortunate at the University of Calgary to have a strong department of religious studies, one that covers the gamut in terms of looking at the great religious traditions of the world. We're especially thankful to be home to the chair of Christian thought. I want to take the opportunity to thank all of the people who have supported the chair of Christian thought over many years now. Doug has been with us, of course, in that position since 1999. I wouldn't be doing my job as a dean if I didn't put in the plug for even more so for the chair of Christian thought and for all the activities that go along with it. But most of all tonight, I simply want to express my thanks, certainly as Dean of Arts, and thanks to the University of Calgary for this generous support that has come from many parts of the Calgary community in support of what I think is really a wonderful mission. So let me turn to introducing our speaker tonight. Doug, as I say, has been the chair of Christian thought at the University of Calgary since 1999. He studied at the University of Waterloo, where he did his dissertation. He has worked largely in the field of German pietism. He's written 2 books, more than 30 articles in journals and books that have been published around the world. He is working on a book that I think is coming very soon on an introduction to German pietism that I understand is going to be published by Johns Hopkins University Press. Really a sign, I think, of the significance of his work, that it's being recognized and going to be published by one of the leading academic publishers in North America. So Doug, I invite you to come forward. This topic, as I said, is the Church of the Academy, the church historian and author to the church.
Thank you. It's always a bad sign when there's lots of water because it's going to be needed. Thank you so much to Annesley for hosting this evening. Christ Church certainly is a special venue for my wife and me. Our daughter was married here about 5 years ago, so it has special memories. Thank you, Kevin, for your introduction, and it's been I think a pleasure for me to hold this position of the Chair of Christian Thought at the University of Calgary. When I explain to people what this position involves, they often can't quite believe it, on several reasons. For one thing, it has such an interesting combination of the academic and the practical in the community with hosting events like this. And then, of course, just the fact that this is in a secular university, that this position exists. So it is unique, and I count myself privileged to be able to hold and do the work that is involved in this chair. This is a perennial topic tonight. As Annesley mentioned, we can go back to Tertullian, who asked, what does Jerusalem have to do with Athens? Why would a Christian, with the resources of the gospel and the scriptures and the creeds, need anything that Athens, that Greek philosophy might have to offer? Now, I must say that Tertullian's was, I think, a minority position even in his day, but nevertheless, the position was there. And the question that it poses is a sharp one, it's a pressing one, and it's one that, like most questions of faith and philosophy and politics, we need to keep answering these questions. I think one of the frustrations of growing older is that the questions get raised and we say, 25 years ago we were discussing that. But the questions do need to get raised in every generation, don't they? And they usually are answered a bit differently in every generation. And so my topic is the church and the academy. What a historian of Christianity can offer the church of today. There is that angle on it, since I am a historian of Christianity. What might this particular academic expertise have to contribute to the life of the church? So it's a question that I think needs to be posed. There are related questions to this. How should the church view academic research, especially when it touches upon matters of faith, biblical studies, philosophical theology, hermeneutics, history? There are many, many disciplines that impinge upon the faith of the church and the beliefs of the church. How should the church view these disciplines? More specifically, how should believers and their clergy consider and evaluate the research and writing that come out of the academy? My question isn't, what is the place of Christians in the academy? My question is the other way around. What is the place of the academy in the church? Should it be welcomed with open arms? Should it be welcomed skeptically or with care? That's the question. I have one classic answer for you. Universities, with their programs of study, their colleges, their degrees, and their professorships, are products of vain heathenism. They are as much good to the church as the devil is. That's a point of view. That's not our 2nd century church father, Tertullian. That is actually John Wycliffe, 1329 to 1384. I'll read it again. Universities with their programs of study, their colleges, their degrees, their professorships are products of vain heathenism. They're as much good to the church as the devil is. He actually had studied at Oxford himself, but he, of course, had become somewhat disillusioned. Fortunately, there are other views, and Avery Dulles, a Catholic theologian, has a very different view. He passed away just a couple of years ago. He was convinced that the intellectual probings of scholars have given the church an invaluable doctrinal resource. University theology and religious studies have ably served the church in centuries past and are urgently needed in our day. So there are two contrasting views. The place of the academy in the church. One, a naysayer, the other, quite positive. And I can think of many other questions that spin off from this. As I tell my students, really, at least half of the academic battle is asking the right questions. I hope I've asked some of the right questions. So, for example, how have Christians throughout the modern age especially, say since 1800, how have Christians since 1800 viewed the academic study of their religion? Have they welcomed it? Have they learned from it? Or another question, what past polemics and present-day suspicions cast a bit of a pall over this question? So we don't really come at it with neutrality, we come at it with baggage. That people are invested in this question because of past polemics, present-day suspicions. How much of that is there? What cultural differences can we identify between the church and the academy that may make this a problematic relationship? I call them cultural differences. I'll say more about that in a minute. Are there examples of a really fruitful exchange between the two? Times when the church has welcomed and benefited the insights of the academy? How have scholars of the Christian tradition and their work benefited the church? When you get right down to it, what has been the legacy of help and inspiration, if any? Might the study of here's an interesting question. Might the study of the Christian tradition by a non-Christian scholar potentially benefit the church? Is that conceivable? That in some fields of research, say archaeology, that there are people researching in areas, my wife and I were a year ago, actually, we were in Turkey. I was supposed to be working hard in sabbatical, but we took a week off to go to Turkey over Valentine's, and we visited Ephesus, which has like a kilometer-long set of ruins dating from the Roman Empire, including an amphitheater, and where I practiced my projection in that Roman amphitheater. But one can conceive that, and of course, Ephesus is one of the 7 churches from the book of Revelation, the 7 letters in Revelation 2 and 3. All of those 7 cities to which those letters are addressed are in modern-day Turkey, in Revelation 2 and 3. And one can ask, well, could a non-Christian researcher, archaeologist discover things that would potentially be of value to people who wanted to research those 7 cities and those 7 churches? How might my own study of German pietism be of benefit to the church? Now, I'm really pushing it. I can only address some of these questions, of course, in my talk this evening. Now, of course, right off the top, it's clear that different branches, one can't speak monolithically, different branches of the Christian church will respond differently to the question I'm posing this evening. In some church settings, the university is still seen as suspect, a place that is a threat to the faith of their young people, and so to be avoided. And I actually don't need to, suffice to say that in my own youth I experienced some of this attitude. Youth are encouraged to attend Bible colleges or trade schools rather than the universities, which are perceived as more of a threat. In other churches, the clergy themselves are university trained and educated. The life of the mind is encouraged. But I would suggest that even here, the relationship between church and academy can still be complex, it can still be conflicted, it can still be troubled by jealousy and suspicion. So I want to clear the ground by looking at what I call the cultural differences between the church and the academy. Differences that I think can make this a bit of a rocky relationship. And then we'll look at some suspicions and polemics. And then I want to look at two scholars who have suggested there's a very positive working relationship here, Margaret Miles and Rowan Williams. We're in an Anglican church this evening. Rowan Williams is the current Archbishop of Canterbury, but also an academic. And then finally, I will discuss somewhat how my own research might benefit the church. So I call this part of my lecture a tale of two cultures. And those two cultures are the university, the academy rather, and the church. And please take your handout. Does anybody not have a handout? Please take your handout, and there you have a table that I have created with some helpful revisions from my wife. It's much better because of Heather's contribution. I have attempted to think about these two realms, these two institutions, these two Western communities in terms of culture. And I'm looking at dominant attitude, beginnings, guiding traditions, leading representatives, values, genres, and activities. And you can see there certainly is a contrast here. And it may be somewhat simplistic, but I'm trying to get at the fact that there's a different cultural atmosphere and history going on in these two institutions. And so, for example, under attitude, certainly one thinks of faith as the dominant attitude in the church setting, criticism, the dominant attitude in the academic setting. In terms of history, both have a long history. Now, I know that a person like Roy Darkus might say that the history of the academy goes back to classic Greek times, but in terms of the modern, not modern, but at least, well, in terms of our modern university, we do think of a beginning around the 13th century in Paris. Of course, the Christian church to the 1st century. Guiding traditions. Certainly the university has its traditions. It has its disciplines. One simply needs to go to an academic graduation in the spring or in the fall to learn something about university traditions, including gowns and hoods and traditional faculties. Many of the traditions that we assume today actually go back to 13th century Paris. They already had faculties of law and arts or philosophy, theology, medicine. Those things were all in place already in the 13th century and 14th century in Oxford and Cambridge. So the university has a long tradition. Of course, the Christian church has a long tradition, represented in its scriptures, in its creeds. I'm thinking of the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed, which are still recited in many church communities. And then in terms of leading representatives, there could even be some overlap here with, say, like a person like Thomas Aquinas. But I've listed some people that maybe are outstanding for the way they've contributed to the culture and who in many ways are cited even today as an authority, as an example, as a model, as a source of wisdom for living the Christian life today. Values and norms. I put love and mercy, or faith, hope, and love could come in there as well under church. Curiosity and knowledge under the academy. There was a famous debate between Abelard and Bernard of Clairvaux over precisely this point. Learning had belonged to the monastery. Knowledge was for salvation. And the modern university pushed that knowledge outside of the monastic setting, outside of a purely church context, to give it value in and of itself. And that was highly controversial with Abelard and the kind of position that he represented, Bernard of Clairvaux. It actually got quite wicked, quite nasty, that classic controversy between church and academy. Under literary genres, I thought to myself, what are some typical genres in terms of the church setting that one would find in a worship service, for example, or among Christian writers, and you get preaching. There was a time, actually, when sermons were published as well. Many preachers would preach, and still do, preach thousands of sermons. And there was a day when those sermons would be printed, so that if you actually missed church one Sunday, you could read it a few months later. Song, apologetics, biblical interpretation, those are some obvious genres in the church culture. On the academic side, of course, conference papers, articles, books, reviews. Just today, I picked up a review of a book I published 2 years ago. You always read these things with fear and trembling. What did I miss? And there are a couple of things that he mentioned, but this is part of the life of the academy. Accountability, questioning, even at a conference. There can be, have you read this? What about this argument? And one is constantly accountable and under scrutiny. And it's that exchange that advances knowledge. That is part of the academic culture. Finally, activities. Came to mind worship, evangelism, theological reflection, of course, social activism in the church culture, experiment, research into the ways of the world. I've tried to be somewhat generic here because research methods vary, of course, among the disciplines. But what they have in common, I'd suggest, is a disciplinary program of gaining knowledge, testing knowledge, advancing knowledge, investigating knowledge, and doing research. In my field, you do the research by visiting, hopefully, the archive. The best sources are sources that take you as close to the subject of study as possible. And usually even published sources are considered second-rate to the unpublished sources, the letters, the things that nobody else has scrutinized before. That's the best kind of knowledge in the field of research that I'm in. Okay, that's a scheme, it's a table. I hope it gets at the fact that we're dealing with two very different cultures here. And it is very easy, I think, for these cultures to be critical of one another and to use caricatures in describing one another. So, for example, some of our critics today, they say that Christianity is unreasonable. Or, on the other hand, for people in the academy to claim that Christians, or the other way around rather, people in the church to claim that there's no faith in the academy. There can be criticisms both ways. And typically, often those criticisms are caricatures and unfruitful and unhelpful and not really getting at what I think is the potential for a fruitful relationship. I'm tempted to stop now and get some questions, but maybe I'll wait to the end and we can discuss these things then. My inspiration for this table came from Mark Knoll. Mark Knoll wrote a book entitled Faith and Criticism. And that book, Faith and Criticism, was describing the culture of evangelical scholarship in the field of biblical studies, and suggesting that biblical scholars who are evangelical are often in a rough situation. They're between faith and criticism. As conservative Christians, they're in a church setting that is suspicious of the academy. In the academy, they're in a setting that is suspicious of the church. And so in this particular book, he's describing a scenario of scholars who are conflicted because they live in both settings, and because those settings are often polarized, their own life can be polarized. But before I move on, I just want to observe that polarization is not what this is all about. The fact is, there is huge overlap between these two cultures. Obviously, that's where I'm coming from this evening. I think there is a huge overlap between these two cultures and a huge potential for mutual engagement. Why would I say that? Well, for one, is the simple fact that for much of Christian history, the people who served in the academy also served in the church. For much of the university's history, people in the university also lived in the church. There was this dual experience, this dual culture that these scholars experienced. John Paul II, the previous pope, wrote an encyclical in which he commented that the university was born from the heart of the church. A very beautiful image. The university was born from the heart of the church. Ex corde ecclesiae was the name of that encyclical. And of course, that's true. The medieval university was a Christian institution. It was designed, according to Joseph Pieper, the young European peoples wanted to come to terms with their two great inheritances. And one great inheritance was the classical inheritance of Greek and Roman thought. And the other great inheritance was the fathers and the tradition of theology and the Bible. And the great motivation of the modern university was people like Thomas Aquinas trying to come to terms with these two inheritances. And with an optimism, it might strike us as naive, with an optimism that they were perfectly compatible when they were both done rightly. When the Christian inheritance was rightly understood and when the classical inheritance was rightly understood, they were a perfect complement. Nature and grace, faith and reason, no problem. A truth of reason couldn't possibly contradict a truth of faith. And so we have Aquinas's actually almost naive taking of Aristotle, who was the greatest empirical thinker of that time, in the confidence that Aristotle couldn't possibly contradict the Bible when he was rightly understood. And so that is a part of this conversation, that kind of optimism. The fact that these two have this huge overlap. And of course, one can bring it up. One doesn't have to go that far back. One can go to the Enlightenment and the rise of modern science, even modern philosophy. People like René Descartes, Leibniz, Isaac Newton. All of these people were not people, put it positively, they were people whose curiosity and use of reason in a characteristically modern way was motivated by a Christian faith. Right? All of these people saw themselves as Christian. Leibniz and Newton, the two founders of calculus, both of them mathematizing the natural world. Descartes trying to improve upon Augustine and Aquinas and understanding making proofs for God's existence. These people were not trying to undermine the church. Even these early modern thinkers that we think of today as modern. A second reason for the overlap is that the church has always valued knowledge. The church is a teaching institution. And when one thinks about it, much of a clergy person's activity is teaching. And when one is a full-fledged member of the church, there are things one has to learn to become a part of the church. And many of these things are historical, for example. There's knowledge to be learned. Christianity is a teaching religion, and the Christian culture is a teaching community. Maybe I should have done a better job of making that clear, that there is this common teaching aspect to these two cultures. And then thirdly, for much of its history, Christian leaders have valued secular education. And of course, the prime example of this is St. Augustine. In his famous treatise on Christian doctrine, Augustine reflected on what one needs to know and learn to be a good interpreter of the Bible. What kind of education is appropriate for Christian interpreters and thinkers? And basically what he said is secular education, the liberal arts, the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric. And Augustine, he had a beautiful metaphor for explaining this. Why would it be that to train a Christian clergy person, to train a Christian person to understand the Bible, that they would turn to secular arts? Augustine said, it's like this. It's like this. Remember when Israel was about to follow Moses out of Egypt? What did they do? They borrowed all kinds of things from their Egyptian neighbors. They despoiled the Egyptians. And Augustine said that is a beautiful example of what we need to do in the academic area. And I quote, "The Egyptians," said Augustine, "had not only idols, grave burdens, which the people of Israel detested and avoided. But the Egyptians also had vases, ornaments of gold and silver, which the Israelites took with them secretly when they fled, as if to put them to better use. In the same way, the teachings of the pagans contain not only superstitious imaginings which Christians ought to abominate and avoid, but also liberal disciplines suited to the uses of truth. These are, as it were, the gold and silver. The Christian should take this treasure with him for the just use of teaching the gospel, converting it to Christian uses. This was done by Moses, of whom it is written, he was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. And then a final point in terms of this overlap, there are features of the Christian faith that encourage the life of the mind. And there's a very fine book, How Christian Faith Can Sustain the Life of the Mind, by Richard Hughes. And he actually canvasses the different denominations in the Christian church, arguing that every one of them has within its own world of thought and culture an encouragement to use the mind, an encouragement to education. The Roman Catholic Church, for example, values the life of the mind because of the sacramental principle. The natural world, human culture, have intrinsic worth as the good creation of God. The natural world has the potential to be used of God, to lead one to grace and to biblical truth. So God is present and at work in the created order. When one studies the created order, one is studying the handiwork of God. So that's the Catholic Church. Luther emphasized human limitation and finitude. Everything we do and everything we think is always flawed, always fragmentary, always incomplete. And that is a great motivation to keep questioning, to keep examining, to keep improving. We need to use our minds because we usually get it wrong the first time. We need to learn and improve over a lifetime. We need to keep learning. That's Luther. The Anglican Church is marked by its famous three-legged stool, its approach to Christian faith and life that recognizes the threefold authority of Scripture, tradition, and reason. And then, of course, there's the Reformed Calvinist tradition, in which this is our Father's world, and all truth is God's truth. All truth falls under the kingship of Christ. Everything, including our thoughts, should be taken captive to Christ. That's the Reformed view. Finally, the Mennonite tradition. Hughes says the Mennonite tradition has always been a tradition that questioned the status quo, questioned the authorities that be. Mennonites use their minds to look carefully at the assumptions of the age and to compare them with the values of the Christian scriptures. That's an intellectual exercise that the Mennonites have always valued and used to question conventional wisdom, to be suspicious of the status quo. All right, I rest my case. I think there's great overlap, great potential, at least at this point, great potential for cooperation and engagement between these two cultures. But I can't go on without acknowledging conflict and suspicion. So I want to say a little bit about that side of this relationship, the negative side, the suspicious side, the problematic side. Certainly in the last 2 centuries, in this modern age, I think many of us have been taught that these are cultures that fall into inevitable conflict. And we've been taught that the church, right, was suspicious of Galileo. Every advance in science has been against the goodwill of the church. And a famous book by White called The Warfare of Science and Religion, for example. And that thesis has long since been overturned. The thesis of that book and that model has long since been overturned for reasons that I just mentioned, that so many early modern scientists were Christian. You've got a problem here with your evidence, obviously. The fact remains that conflicts there were. And in some sectors of the church and in some sectors of the academy, there have been great battles and great conflicts. And Mark Knoll suggests that certainly in North America, and I think he's thinking in the United States, even today, there is this inevitable conflict that is raised. And Knoll suggests that it's because religion, Christianity in the States, is marked by piety and activism. When one thinks of Christianity in America, especially evangelical Christianity, one thinks of piety, one thinks of activism as being more highly valued than thinking the faith. Experiential, expressive religion seems more exciting, more fulfilling than exposure to study and historical interpretation and narrative. But without basic knowledge, there's not going to be a strong, reflective community of Christians. Bruce Gunther recently observed that there are whole denominations in their budgets, in their own values, clearly give preference to piety over learning. They fail to see the value of remembering even their own history. But then he does have a footnote, and I do like to read footnotes. And in his footnote, he noted that there are some 35 evangelical Protestant denominations in Canada that have produced a history of their own denomination, a one-volume history. Then he goes on to say these works do vary greatly in quality. But nevertheless, there is it's not a total wasteland in terms of historical interest. So there is this, I'll call this reason anti-intellectualism. There is this there's this polarization of piety and reason. One chooses one or the other. There is that anti-intellectual mindset in some settings of the church. A second reason that I would bring to mind is that I think it's easy for people in the Christian culture to seek security. I think, I didn't mention that either on this table, but a certain sense of spiritual and intellectual security and comfort and assurance often go with the church culture. And so I think believers and their clergy can be uncomfortable with new knowledge. I don't think this is true of many clergy, but for some clergy, it's the commentaries one used at seminary and the interpretations one learned at seminary, rather than having to encounter new interpretations and new scholarship. I remember my Old Testament professor at Westminster, Raymond Dillard, saying he found more useful material for sermon preparation in the Biblical Archaeologist than he did in most commentaries. So is there an openness to new learning? Sometimes there is, sometimes not. Finally, Rowan Williams suggests that, especially in the area of studying the Christian past, there's a problem in our society with anything to do with the past. And Williams actually divides this into two reasons. He says, well, there are the traditionalists, people who think that they're true to the early church. Well, why would they want to study the Christian past? They don't expect to be surprised by it. People in the Christian past believe what I believe. So why waste your time? So some of these traditionalists are not motivated because they don't expect to find anything they don't already know. I remember in one setting I was teaching a course in a church setting about the church fathers. And a person came to me afterwards and said, I don't think I can attend this anymore. I just find these people too strange. I don't know what to do with this. It was too disturbing to his own worldview to encounter church fathers who welcomed martyrdom and whose theology was just so different from his own. On the other hand, there are progressives who aren't interested in the Christian past because they don't expect to be interested or questioned by it. Why would you study the Christian past when you're living in 2001? Like what's the value? And so the traditionalist thinks he already knows what the past represents. The progressivist thinks, well, all that I need to know, knowledge is advancing. Why would I want to study old knowledge? So I'd suggest those are maybe a couple of reasons why there isn't the interest, say, in my discipline of the study of the Christian past that maybe there has been in other times. All right, I want to look at Margaret Miles and Rowan Williams in a bit of detail. Margaret Miles was a Christian thought lecturer in Calgary in 2002. I know because I was on sabbatical and I didn't get to hear her. Margaret Miles was born in Alberta. She now teaches at historical theology at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. She entitled her 1999 American Academy of Religion presidential address, "Becoming Answerable for What We See." And she was calling on scholars of religion, religious studies scholars, theologians, to fulfill their academic work with a sense of the non-academic audience that they could be serving. It was a very fine lecture. She says most scholars have three audiences to whom they are responsible: the public sphere, the church, and the university. And he suggests that all of us should try, in some measure, to serve all of those. It was a very challenging lecture. In fact, I think many of us in the academy today are being encouraged to think about how our research might benefit our civil society. I see Wayne McCready here. That's Wayne's been his emphasis for some time. Miles suggests that scholarship has a prophetic role to challenge, unsettle, and discomfort religious people. Scholarship has a prophetic imperative to challenge, unsettle, and discomfort religious people. I know that one needs to be careful. One needs, of course, to be responsible, and one needs to be sure that this has a positive intent behind it. But she goes on to describe what that positive intent might be. Church historians can identify the circumstances in which past Christians made their decisions and lived out their lives and made their statements of faith. And sometimes things change. Sometimes we understand things today that Christians in the past didn't understand. But she goes even further. She says we need to look at the intentions of the Christian church, not only the intentions of the Christian church, but the effects. And historians of religion need to be honest about how certain Christian convictions and groups and movements, how they have worked themselves out over time. And very often, there are groups that have the noblest intentions, but their results can be less than noble. And she goes on to talk about her own experience in a fundamentalist setting and how damaging it was to her and how her study of the Christian tradition liberated her from what she now sees as an unhealthy form of religion. The Academy can help with that. The Academy can indicate where certain forms of religion are unhealthy for family life, for psychology, for living a full and rich life in this world. So that's Margaret Miles. She is convinced that there is a role the Academy can play in serving the common good and the cause of believers. Now I come to Rowan Williams. Rowan Williams, in my opinion, is one of the most interesting churchmen and academics in the world today. He has lived in the Academy, and of course now he is the Archbishop of Canterbury over the Anglican Church and worldwide. He wrote a book in 2005 entitled, "Why Study the Past?" And he came up with three interesting answers. He said, first, the exercise of examining the history of the church provides believers with self-understanding and identity. Sometimes I use the example of even family history. You know, what is our family history? I was in Utah with my wife for a conference some time ago, and there's this amazing genealogical museum and library there. And on my way out, I'd get to a meeting. I just said to a greeter at the door, I just found out that my family are all horse thieves. And I was just kidding, and the person didn't see the joke. But the fact is that I think many of us are interested in our family history. Where do we come from? How did our family get to North America? Did they come here under duress of various kinds? For religious reasons or less noble reasons? Well, you know, being part of the Christian church is like that. What is the family history of the Christian church? What is this identity that one has when one identifies oneself as Christian? There have been Christians for 2,000 years. Well, what is that identity? What is that heritage? Some of which can be embarrassing, some of which can be inspiring. So that's one reason Williams is saying to study the past. Know your identity. Know the family history of Christians. Secondly, the Christian past is the story of the body of Christ. And he says, in studying the past, we're entering into this history. And of course, the body of Christ, the image of Paul with the body is the mutual nurturing and care. And he says, when we study this past, it's not just any past. It's a past that has the potential to nurture and to edify and to encourage. And then finally, he says the church should look at Christian history in the expectation of being surprised and questioned by it. Being surprised and questioned by it. C.S. Lewis talked about that. He said, if you want to get some perspective on our Christian existence today, we need to compare it to something else. We can't compare it to the future, compare it to the past. And we get a sense of how maybe our own idea of what it means to be a Christian is dramatically different than what it meant to be a Christian 200 years ago, or 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago. And so there's a kind of wake-up call that can come from being confronted with traditions of people who call themselves Christians, but live that out in very, very different ways in very, very different times. Williams himself has written, his classic academic book is a book on Arius, the arch heretic. Arius and the Arian tradition. It's a tradition that questioned the idea of Jesus being co-eternal with God. If you were to draw a vertical line and put God on one side and the creation on the other side, Arius said that Jesus and Christ would end up being the greatest of God's creations. And of course, that view was opposed by Athanasius and the Council of Nicaea, which gave rise to the Nicene Creed. So this is the story, this is the heretic that Rowan Williams examines, and it's a fascinating book. But I find it interesting that even in this somewhat highly theological, complicated book, he says, quote, "My hope is that the public for this book on Arius will include those concerned for the church's health as well as the academy." So writing this study, he said, I'm really hoping that this will benefit the church and that people will read it who aren't just academics. So what are some of the insights to be gained from this? Well, near the end, he tells us. He tells us some of the insights he thinks the church could gain from his study of Arius. Number one, he says it's interesting to see in this ancient controversy that gave rise to the Nicene Creed, it's interesting to see that the church confronted new questions, new language, new debates that it had to somehow come to terms with. They could no longer just keep repeating old language and old formulas. That would not be adequate, because both sides were repeating the old language and the old formulas, but meaning different things by it. He said they had to choose which kind of innovation would best serve the integrity of the faith handed down. I'll read that again. In the 4th century, the Christian church had to choose which kind of innovation would serve the integrity of the faith handed down. To reject all innovation was no longer an option. The church had to move from a theology of repetition to something constructive. It's true, the church's theology begins in the language of worship, but it can't stop there. That's Rowan Williams. A lesson learned from Arius in that great debate. Secondly, he says, the story of the Arian dispute shows that Scripture and tradition must be read afresh from one generation to another. The task of interpretation and application must be taken up by every generation, by every age. So I think some practical, encouraging points to be made there. Sometimes one says, the church, why can't we just be like we were 25 years ago? And Williams goes to the 4th century and says, they couldn't stay the same way they were 25 years ago. They had to change. They had to innovate. They had to use new language, had to rethink things. And it's not a sin to ask questions and to address the questions that our age is putting to us. That's the lesson of the 4th century. All right, I wish you'd take your handout one more time. And if you're still awake, turn it over. And there I've got 6 theses that I've more or less come up with after my listening to Margaret Miles and Rowan Williams. All right? These are 6 things that I've I'm fairly confident of. 6 theses on how historians of Christianity, in particular, the Academy, can benefit the church of today. Number 1, the Academy helps the church by preserving collective memory, helping the church derive a collective identity. The historian has a role to play as the church's rememberer, as the conduit to its traditions and earlier times. Thesis 2, the Academy guides the church in study of the past in the expectation the church will be surprised and questioned and nurtured by it. Number 3, scholarship has a prophetic role in challenging, unsettling, and discomfiting religious people, as well as affirming and educating. The Academy studies tradition for its pitfalls, as well as its insights, and notes where it reflects outdated cultural assumptions. An example of this just came to mind in my own doctoral research field. In the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition, for centuries, the tradition had been disparaged by the reigning orthodoxies of Lutheranism and Calvinism and Roman Catholicism. And around the mid-20th century, there was an outstanding Mennonite historian named Harold Bender who did a doctoral thesis on Conrad Grebel and the earliest Mennonites, earliest Anabaptists, and argued that all of these slanders of the centuries were unfounded, that they were pacifists, they were simple followers of Christ and Sermon on the Mount, they simply wanted to have a believer's church, and they'd been unjustly persecuted. And many of the arguments that had been used to disparage them were because people had pointed to people that weren't Mennonites at all. Now, I would say in the last 50 years, Harold Bender is seen as one side of the pendulum versus the other side. And you know how pendulums work. They come back. And so in the last 50 years, historians have said, Bender pointed out an aspect that needed to be emphasized. But these Mennonites weren't perfect. These Anabaptists weren't perfect. And some of the criticisms were valid. And so that is just a quick look at how Anabaptist studies has evolved in recent years, to go from being tools of the devil to being followers of Christ on earth in all perfection to being less than perfect. Werner Packel, my doctor father, wrote a book on the Hutterites, showed the incredible squabbles among the early Hutterite leaders. They're human. And they had great intentions. They didn't always live out their own best intentions. So that's an example of number 3. Number 4, critical study of the Christian tradition involves examining, as I said, social effects, personal effects, as well as intentions. We need to study can liberate believers from oppressive forms of religion. Number 5, past tradition can function as a criticism and alternative to modernity, to the modern form of the church. By comparing churches of the present with the church of the past, we're reminded that modernity's standpoint is not a privileged one. I think from a historical point of view, we also are only an historical period. And 50 years from now, we don't have that perspective on ourselves, but the fact remains that's true. We have our own flaws, our own limitations, and somehow we're so good at pointing out the flaws of an earlier time and so great at overlooking our own. And the argument here is that we need the Christian past to maybe put ourselves in a bit of perspective. And then finally, I suggest that fluency in religious history is the best weapon against fundamentalism. Theses 3 and 4 especially work as a preventive in showing the time-bound setting and imperfections that are at work in all Christian traditions. Now, I'm hoping you'll ask me some questions about these. I've asked Roy Darkus at the end, I asked Roy Darkus to respond as well, so maybe Roy will pick up on some of these as well. All right, so now I come to German pietism, and to which I've pretty much devoted my academic work since 1992. Somebody came up to me just a few months ago and said, "Why do you spend all your time on those Germans?" And it kind of caught me off guard, but I'm going to answer that question right now. Why I spend all this time on these Germans? I think many of us can trace vocational choices back to our youth, our childhood. My wife would say that she already had an interest in nursing as a young girl. She'd go to the hospital with her father, who was a minister, and it just seemed like an interesting place to work. And at that time, she didn't have the option of being a minister, so nursing was an option. My sister Jane, I think from early on, wanted to be a teacher like our mother. I found it interesting in listening to Barack Obama last week, who spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington, D.C. He spoke about influences on his own life. I don't know if any of you heard this, February 3rd at the 9 a.m. prayer breakfast. He credited 3 great influences that he says basically brought him to where he was as president. And one was his mother's values of the Golden Rule and the equal worth of all human beings. Of course, his mother was not a church person at all. Second, the impact of faith leaders of the civil rights movement in America. Baptist leaders like Martin Luther King. And then thirdly, his own experience working in Southside Chicago, where he worked with churches and basically advocating for civil rights and community improvement. He was a community organizer. Those are some of the main influences. I think in my own experience, I could point to some similar influences as well. If you would ask me in grade 11, what do you want to do? I would say, well, I'd like to get a PhD in history and be a university prof. I think I probably would have said that. I had an excellent history teacher in grade 11. But furthermore, there was the experience of being, as a young fellow, 11, 12 years old, growing up in United Church of Canada, the experience of my parents becoming unsettled with their church situation and deciding that they would become Baptists. So I'm observing all of this, and I'm hearing their reasoning, and I, at the age of 12, became aware that Christians have these huge disagreements. They're very important. My grandparents, by the way, were all United Church. And, and they made this decision. I saw this variety. I saw this disagreement. I wanted to figure, what is that all about? And I would say that goes a long way to explaining why I am right here, right now, giving this lecture. Some of those questions have followed me to the present day. And then, of course, growing up in Kitchener-Waterloo. Kitchener-Waterloo was settled by German Lutherans and Mennonites as the first European settlers, of course. And not surprisingly, there's Waterloo Lutheran University in the 1960s and before, who actually had a Mennonite president in the 60s. Waterloo Lutheran University. There was Conrad Grebel College at University of Waterloo. And there was this amazing Reformation history PhD program going on there, probably one of the best in North America. And it reflected the culture of the place. Why not study these things when they were so important in the founding of that community? And so I decided to do a PhD in Reformation history at the University of Waterloo. But now, and that's not pietism either. In 1992, I needed a new project. I had a sabbatical. I had to convince my university to let me go to some place wonderful and not teach for a year. And I had been put in touch with Hans Schneider at Marburg University, and he sent back this 10-page letter telling me a project that I could just start. It was just, he basically put it in my lap. Working bibliography of sources, and he invited me to come, was going to give me an office. And just before I left after that year, we ended up going, of course. Just before I left, I was put in touch with a retired German Lutheran pastor who had spent 20 years collecting sources in the area of my research. And I visited him, and he gave me 2 shopping bags full of photocopies that he had been collecting for 20 years. And that is behind the book that I published 2 years ago on Konrad Brusky. So those are some circumstances that got me into studying these Germans. And I might say that a year ago, Heather and I were in Germany working on yet another project on German pietism. And this project will be a new introduction, the first introduction to German pietism written in over a generation. And that might surprise you. I mean, German and Swiss Protestantism have had a huge impact on Christianity. Luther, Zwingli, Melanchthon, Johann Arndt, Philipp Jakob Spener, Friedrich Schleiermacher, Rudolf Bultmann, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Paul Tillich, Helmut Tillicke, Dorothee Zola, Hans Kuhn. All of these people write in German, and only a fraction of their writings have ever been translated into English. Bonhoeffer's writings became available in English for the first time last year. Karl Barth's church dogmatics have just gone through a revision in terms of English translation. That's just the dogmatics. I mean, it's massive. He wrote probably almost as much again that has not been translated. And so I kind of enjoy language. I have a fascination with these past Christians who get so angry with each other. That's pretty much why I do what I do. This semester, in fact, I'm teaching a course at U of C entitled German Pietism and Enlightenment Thought, from 1670 to 1780. And I've spent the first 5 weeks talking about what German Pietism is and using the manuscript of my new book as one of the texts. So what was German Pietism? It was a lay-inspired Protestant movement in the late 17th century that aimed to bring spiritual renewal to believers in Lutheran and Calvinist churches, all right? Protestantism, a century and a half after Luther, in the mind of the Pietists, is no better than the Catholics. That's kind of the ultimate criticism. They're no better than the Catholics. That was their mindset, all right? So Spener himself put it this way. He said, the Lutheran Church in Germany is seriously ill, it is lying on its sickbed, is in need of a physician and medication to treat an illness that has spread throughout the whole body. And that's the Lutheran Church he's talking about. And so Pietism are just so profoundly disillusioned with the church they see around them. It's not the church that Luther would have intended. Now, of course, the big question comes, what's the remedy going to be? And by the way, Spener wrote a kind of manifesto for Pietism called Pious Desires, Pious Longings. It has a threefold medical outline. Corrupt condition of the church, hopes for improvement, and remedy, therapy. That's actually the outline of his little text. And so he treats the sick patient, looks at the sick patient rather. He says, there is a better day ahead for the church. There's a cure. And then he tells what the cure is. There's sixfold therapy, sixfold remedy. I just dislocated my shoulder a few days ago. And I'm glad that there's actually a physiotherapy remedy for this problem that I have. The arm may look okay, but it's not, believe me. This arm is like the church in Germany in Spener's time. It's corrupt. It's in bad shape. Spener had sixfold remedy, and fundamental to it was renewed study of God's Word. Now you might say, well, that's just Luther, isn't it? Not really. And here we need to distinguish intentions from effect. Luther said the Bible must be the only basis of a Christian's life and faith. And for 150 years, Lutherans did not read their Bibles to any great degree. Because Luther said, well, a lot of people are illiterate. If they do read it, they get it wrong. So Luther said, if they study my catechism, that can be the Bible for them. For about 150 years, Lutherans learned their Bible from Luther's catechism. This is Lutherans. These are Protestants, sola scriptura, intentions, results. The Pietists came along and said, it's time. All right? Let's get people reading the Bible. Luther himself translated the Bible. And we're talking about this tomorrow in my class. Luther himself translated the Bible. There was almost no translation of the Bible into German after Luther, until the Pietists came along, and in 25 years there were 10 new translations. All right? The Bible is coming alive in this setting, and that was what it was all about. That's what Pietism was all about. Spener also called for establishing the spiritual priesthood, in which Christians would discuss the Bible with each other, edify each other. The question I guess one can ask is this an overcorrective, all right? What I talked about in terms of the Mennonites before, you've got an unhappy church situation. Is Pietism, is it an overcorrective? Is it really the answer? All right, I don't think it is, to be quite honest. I think it is an overcorrective. It's trying to address the situation. I don't think it has found the middle road. I'll be honest about that. All right, what is the historical context of pietism? I talked about the fact that the church is in such a mess. The context that explains much of this problem with the church is the 30 Years' War. And the 30 Years' War was the ultimate result of this split between Catholics and Protestants. And for 30 years, there was unbelievable barbarity practiced by Christian against Christian, prince against prince, city against city, region against region, mostly within Germany, but touching other parts of Europe as well. In the name of religion, there was unbelievable inhumanity. In a mixed setting, I would not want to describe in detail the tortures that were practiced. These are tortures of Catholics against Protestants, Protestants against each other, Lutherans and Calvinists against each other. Unbelievable tortures. And this went on for over a generation. So pastors are saying, like all people know is poverty, sickness, something like 40% of these Europeans lost, 40% of the population declined, not just through warfare, but through famine. They would burn crops. When troops came into town, you weren't happy when troops came to your town, thinking you'd be protected, because they would just take everything and leave you with nothing. So this kind of disaster had an unbelievably deleterious effect on Christian morality, to say the least. And pastors are saying, like, how do we begin to create a Christian culture again after this? The setting of pietism, interestingly, that's the negative side. The positive side is that pietism arose in two main cities, Frankfurt and Leipzig, which are the most dynamic business cities in Germany at this time. Especially Frankfurt. Frankfurt had a more diverse ethnic and religious population than any other city in Germany in the late 17th century. They had a book fair, they had a business fair, they had just incredible exchange of goods, trade, and people came to practice their trade, to go to these fairs with incredible diversity of backgrounds. And much of this trade was in illegal literature. They would import books from the Netherlands, from England. They're actually illegal in parts of Germany because it was strictly Lutheran or Catholic. But the merchants were the vanguard of this trade in books that couldn't be obtained otherwise. So that's one aspect. Another aspect, of course, would be millenarian beliefs. Typical of Luther and traditional Catholicism is the belief that the next great event in God's plan is the final judgment. And Luther believed that. And the pietists said, well, Luther was out by about 1,000 years. Because God has a better day for the church. The millennium is going to arrive. This is post-millennial. Christ isn't going to come until after the millennium. Before the last judgment, there's this little thing called the 1,000-year millennium that's got to come first. So you can see that pietists were antagonizing their own fellow Lutherans by saying, yeah, Luther didn't quite get this right. He was out by about 1,000 years or more in his calculation of the last judgment. And I asked myself, well, where did pietists get this idea of religious renewal and this coming millennial kingdom? And actually, there's an answer staring one right in the face. And that is that in the late 17th century, the Ottoman Turks were driven back from Budapest and Eastern Europe. And up to that time, it was thought that the Turks were going to be the hand of God's judgment. The Turks, and actually they believe Christians probably deserve that judgment. Well, the pietists are witnessing something they've never seen before. The Turks have actually been militarily defeated, driven back. Lots of Turkish people are left behind, and they start converting en masse to Christianity. And the pietists say, well, who's ever seen this? Where's this going to stop? The whole world is becoming Christian. I think that's where they get their postmillennialism from. They were riding a wave of optimism. Military success bore results in theological optimism. Okay, and I've got to stop here and give Roy a chance. I think pietism has a fourfold significance. It's a new form of Protestant Christianity. It is utterly unlike Luther, as I've already indicated, although some scholars try to argue that it's consistent Luther. It's not true. It's entirely different, almost entirely different. Another factor is cultural connections. Pietism gives rise to new genres such as spiritual autobiography, journals, magazines, very creative in a literary way. It had a historical impact in terms of the rise of religious individualism. If there's anything that characterizes our society today, it's individualism. Charles Taylor says, if you want to find out where our individualism came from, it's from people like the Pietists and the Methodists, who had this intensely private and individual form of Christianity. And the final form of relevance, I would suggest, is that you don't really understand modern-day evangelicalism without Pietism. I hope as I've been speaking, you've been saying to yourself, oh, I've heard this before, I've heard this before. I think the evangelical Christianity that is so predominant today, you really can't understand where it came from. I mean, it is Protestantism without Luther, evangelical Christianity. Well, if it's not Luther, what is it? It's Pietism. And people like the Wesleys and the Methodists, they themselves have direct links to Pietism. Wesley taught himself German by looking at Pietist hymns and learning to read them. I'm going to have to stop there. I think the Pietists have lots of lessons to teach us. They are a warning because their subjectivity went in some pretty wacky directions sometimes. It was dangerous. It was unbalanced. I think they are at one end of the pendulum. And somehow we need to come back into the center. I'm going to stop there, and Roy, I'm going to ask you to come up. While you're coming, Roy Darkus is a chaplain at the University of Calgary. Before that, he was a priest here at Christ Church. He spent time at the University of Alberta as a chaplain from 1983 to 94. Roy has a master's in classics from UBC, a master's in theology from Harvard, and a PhD in philosophical theology from Concordia University in Montreal. Roy.
Doug has very kindly asked me to give a response, allowing me to give personal reactions. So, first, just to open a discussion, Doug's contrast between the church and the academy, that the dominant attitude of the church is faith. Oh, Doug, I do wish. Faith, let's say faith is the trust that God's not finished with humanity, that we are not, as human beings, all sewed up and wrapped up and just there to be laid out. That there is an unfinished project for humanity. Now that's faith. Now the academy criticism, Hegel made a famous remark that the owl of Minerva only takes flight at dusk. He was saying philosophy only can look at something really when it's dead. And that's what, in a certain sense, criticism secretly desires. Once they start studying you, you're dead, or good as. Many tribes in different places could attest to that, I'm sure. Now, the reality, as opposed to, let's say, the schema, is that within what we call the church, some people badmouth it as religion. The church has worked very hard to get across the idea that life is closed down, that humanity is not an open project at all. We've got the goods on you. We've got everything sewed up about what you ought to do, how you ought to do it, when you ought to do it, and don't talk back. So within that vantage point of, let's call it religion, faith, as you know, gets pretty minimized. The great proponent of this contrast, of course, it's a little square, but now, of course, the scholars who want, in a way, to insist that you don't move unless you kind of be petrified or ossified, the Academy, in a certain sense, God being very large and the Spirit being very free, the Academy often has been, let's say, the vanguard of what faith ought to be, keeping life open, saying the human project still has some surprises that we can't actually determine forever what human nature is and has to be. So within that, let's say, ambiguity of roles, of course, life unfolds. And I'm kind of maybe taking a framework of your remarks, Doug, so that I would situate Margaret Miles and Rowan Williams within this. Margaret Miles, coming from a closed-down Albertan background, perhaps of biblicism, found liberating air within the Academy. The Academy offering perhaps her hope that her life was not closed down and all tightly defined as she had been led to believe. Now, Rowan Williams, these Anglican scholars love to do studies on Arius. Famous precedent, of course, was Newman. And he came out of that with the idea of the development of doctrine. That doctrine doesn't stay the same, has never actually been all set forth and tidied up. And Rowan Williams, he's from a Welsh and English background, by his study of Arius said, well, yes, innovation in a certain sense is where we do make our faith apply to our current circumstance. And now I can say that within the whole scope, just speaking again very personally, I'm very glad that the ordination of women to the priesthood has seen its place now within our communion, and also we're reaching more adequate understanding of sexuality, especially in regard to acceptance of homosexuals as full members of the Christian community. Now, some, of course, regard these as dreadful innovations, even crimes, but nevertheless, simply to close down the discussion does, I suggest, from what Doug has been exploring and presenting to us, actually undermine the basis of faith in the first place. So, within Doug's personal account of his own life, here's Doug being very postmodern, being transparent about his own motivations. He's saying that pietism for him, in a certain sense, was an inspiration. I get a feeling that it arose when life was very much closed down for Christians at that period. And there's a little irony here that now Doug is a scholar. You just see him approaching these 17th century pietists and saying, now what exactly are your family rites and your mating rituals? Pietists wouldn't want to think of themselves as being studied, because study, as I say, is the death of the spirit, but nevertheless, maybe it does them a bit of, it does an energizing gift to us that we are challenged about who we are and how we came to be. So in this sense, Doug, I don't know if I'm asking you a bit, but there's a bit of a prophet in you. And I'll just, since scholar needs a bit of a prophet, because remember, the prophets were the ones who kept telling us life is open to God's word, that you've got it all sewed up, you think, with all your rights and religion, but God's word is going to break that open and will never cease to break that open. And at the same time, then, scholars that have that bit of conviction that life is open and not finished, I think have this gift of encouraging us. Now, on the other hand, every good prophet, I think, needs a bit of the sharp tongue and sharp eyes of a scholar to say, all right, we may have heard that one before, and life was closed down, and it seemed to be under different pretexts, but I now say it's to be opened up again, and the scholarship provides the wherewithal that we can resist that kind of entrapment again. So, responses, and then I invite questions. Either you may question Doug as a scholar or a prophet, and would that be acceptable? Just a scholar. All right. But one gentleman had a hand up.
Well, it seems that in his original, like in your presentation,
Sir, if you could stand up and maybe
in Professor Shantz's presentation, I think it really, when you talked about going to sleep inducing, I thought that maybe that there was something that you were offering that was not any more controversial than an examined faith. But I think there's more to what you're saying than that. I think what you've got kind of maybe in parts 3 and 4 is kind of, as critical legal studies is to philosophy of law, you seem to be arguing for the church historian as kind of meta-disciplinary vantage point for kind of theological activism and critical legal studies within the philosophy of law. And I think that's probably more interesting because I think that's where the rubber hits the road. And I think you alluded to that in some of the positions you talked about the Anglican Church taking over time. So, I mean, if it's an examined faith, I mean, there's no clowns in any rigorous seminary, university or college.
I've got a book here, but it's got great evidence of
Acadia, Professor of New Testament at Acadia University College, and it's called How Modern Scholars Distort the Gospel. Now that to me is a really interesting look within the academy, concerning maybe what the primary source material is that church history really has a point of origin. But it seems, if you wanted to just let the cat out of the bag, it seems that you've got this notion of the church historian as kind of a yeoman or someone at the rudder steering the conceptual framework for how we ought to view, the evolution of the faith in denominations. And I think what I sense is kind of, just as I mentioned, philosophy of law would allow some portions of the court to make law. Despite with the Parliament or the House of Representatives.
I hear what you're saying.
I think
I get your point. Yeah, thank you. I think you're right. I think there's a lot more to be done with the history of the church than has been done. I'll be honest with you, I think that it's an aspect of Christian studies that is almost non-existent in much of the Christian world, if I can be quite blunt about it. Biblical studies is front and center. But I think there is a discipline here that the church needs to pay attention to, and it's got some interesting perspectives to offer. You're exactly right.
yes.
I wanted to ask whether you could elaborate a little more fully the attitude of the pietists to the academy. Some of the greatest American institutions of learning were established by Methodists and Baptists, who also are often the most anti-intellectual.
That's an excellent question. Did everybody hear it? The attitude of the pietists to higher learning. It's a greatly conflicted attitude, I would have to say. I'll just say a couple of things here. the Pietists were instrumental in sending missionaries to other cultures. And those missionaries, I think of Ziegenbalg, who went to South India, he was amazed at what he found there, and he began sending back to Halle and to Franca histories of the place. He even translated some of their writers. And Franca said, I don't want this stuff. I didn't send you to India to tell us about them. I want you to tell them about us. His intellectual curiosity was really disappointing. And Franca himself was criticized for being anti-intellectual. He actually told students, get straight to studying Greek, bypass philosophy, you don't need that to be a clergy person. You wanted to restrict the curriculum for clergy. That was Franca. On the other hand, you have a person like Bengel in Württemberg. Bengel is considered the father of modern biblical criticism. And he spent his life, he was essentially a high school teacher, but he spent his life compiling Greek manuscripts and suggesting rules for determining the best Greek text of the New Testament, and then wrote a commentary on that Greek text. Just brilliant academic work. So Pietism, you get both. It's not a consistent picture.
Any question?
My own background is in science.
Would you mind standing up, sir?
Sure. My own background is in science, and I became very interested in the philosophers of the modern period because of that, because I had such a faith as well. And what seemed clear to me was that a project which looked so promising with Descartes ended with Wittgenstein, who feels that we can't say much about anything. That language is a problem we have. And so I have to see the church as having, in its understanding of faith, as a way to knowledge, a very important key to what has happened to philosophy in its eventual abandonment of any notion of certainty. Because it's very clear if you watch what happens in the 20th century, whether you listen to Bertrand Russell or any of these sophisticated logical philosophers there, you eventually see this one disillusionment which comes from that great thinker, Wittgenstein. And after that, we have the postmodern and post-critical period, and look at postmodern philosophers. Most of them are denying that we can have any access to certainty about anything. And the only exceptions to that seem to be these scholars who have moved from secularism to faith.
Can you hear this back there? Okay, good.
I think of McIntyre.
Yeah.
I think of Michael Polanyi, a number of other people of that genre.
I'd say a couple things in answer to you. I would not understand some of these early modern thinkers in terms of the postmodern result. I wouldn't pin that present skepticism, and I wouldn't pin blame for that on the modern thinkers. I would like to I'd like us to see more of a sympathy for these early modern philosophers and thinkers like Leibniz and Thomasius and others. The great project of many of these people is that, again, in the setting of the 30 Years' War, how can we construct European society on a non-religious basis? That's a pretty logical project after the 30 Years' War. How do we begin to get a society in which people stop killing each other for reasons of religion? And these are faithful people. These are Christian people. So that is their project. And again, Descartes was convinced that Thomas Aquinas was unsatisfactory. How do you improve upon Thomas? So I think it's kind of comes back to Rowan Williams and Aries. You've got new questions. You've got a new situation. You need to respond. You can't just, it's not, same old isn't going to work. And so I think the genius of Leibniz is how do you retain Christian faith and create a peaceful society? And it's a brilliant project. And my own thinking is that Leibniz is probably one of the greatest Christian thinkers of all time. Alas, he wrote in German and Latin, and not getting a great press. But
Also, in the current theological discussion, whereas the previous philosophers talked a lot about substance and what is the real presence, as you know, in the post-structuralist, absence is the big player, and the sensation and encounter with the open spaces and the spaces between things is now looked on as very much a wellspring of meaning, and in a certain sense that's not so distant from faith as a real attitude when you contrast it to certitude, or that absolute idea that we have certainty that's not going to ever be open to challenge. So things are looking up. A couple more, yeah, sir.
I'm struggling to kind of phrase the question, but as I look at this and think about the impact of postmodernism on these two institutions, I wonder where you go for authority when you want to talk about it. I mean, you did tell your own story, that's an example of using a postmodern authority to talk about this. But they were very important to both of these founders of these two institutions. I mean, just,
what were important?
authority, sources of authority. What was the source of authority?
Like positive authority.
Yeah. And I want you to just reflect on how that is changing these institutions. What do you see?
Everybody heard the question? Question about authority. The important category.
I was just going to say, by whose authority do you say this?
The important category for me there is traditions. And, postmodernism is, I think we give it too much credit, to be quite honest. I think it's had its day, in some respects, obviously not in every respect, but I think we can give it too much credit, to be quite blunt. Because, for example, I think under traditions are still with us. And postmodernists say what they will, we still live out of our traditions. And so I'm saying that postmodernism has not removed authorities entirely from our cultural situations, and on both sides. The disciplines, there's still lots about the university today that is traditional. All right? So let's not give postmodernism too much credit, I guess I would say.
And one more? Could we final question?
Really about tradition and history of Christianity, I'm wondering why we didn't hear something about the Orthodox Church, the Oriental Church, the Orthodox Church is about four.
You did. They gave us the Nicene Creed. You did. They gave us the Nicene Creed. Yeah. Yeah, but I did say that. Yeah. So you did hear about it. Yeah. That illustration from Arius, that was an Orthodox illustration. But your point is well taken. I am a historian of the Western Church. And it's not... I think something we need to say as scholars is what we know and what we don't know, what we are scholars of and what we're not scholars of. I can speak with confidence when I speak of the Western Church. The Eastern Church is of equal, or in terms of early church, we wouldn't have the church today with the contribution of the Orthodox Church. But that is not my strength. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Now, in the words of the great Christian classic, Are You Being Served? We've all done very well, and there are refreshments served just to the left here, to the door, into our cook room, and we can chat further there. And
If you would like to be notified of future lectures, I'll have a sign-up sheet on the table of writing material. Some of my past lectures are available for you to pick up for free.
Are we to assume that if you did get notified, we won't be removed from that?
Yes, you can assume. You may get a request for money.
But Doug, please.